Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the channel. My name is Dan. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. This is my back room. You guys don't see this one very often. There's a set of turntables there. It's got a lot of cool decor in it. This is primarily my R&B, funk, soul, hip-hop room. And there's some reggae down there. Some 45s. But this is, for the most part, my hip-hop rap shelf here. It's organized fairly simply for DJing purposes. I have the top shelf 80s hip-hop. The next shelf is 90s hip-hop. The next shelf is 2000s hip-hop. And it goes all the way across. You know, so it makes it pretty easy to find stuff without having to refile stuff. The bottom here is a Prince and Minneapolis related section. Prince and the Minneapolis sound, of course, is very important here in Minneapolis. There's some neo soul, and then a bunch of comps and soundtracks, and then some kind of recent hip hop R&B there. But what I really wanted to show you was my funk soul shelf here, starting with Atlantic Star, Aura, Are You Single's a great song, Miscellaneous A, BT Express has a couple great songs. Barkay has a couple great songs. Archie Bell and the Drells, Booker T and the MGs. Brass Construction is one of the great kind of forgotten funk bands that has some fusion elements to them. Brick has half dozen of the best funk tracks ever. Brothers Johnson, of course, is Quincy Jones' go-to rhythm section. And those two guys are pretty incredible musicians. And James Brown, who was one of the architects, of course, of the entire sound of R&B, hip-hop, and a training ground for a lot of players as well. And of course Jerry Butler, who was part of the Impressions and the Chicago sound, Miscellaneous Bees. Cameo, one of the great 80s funk bands, whose first few records was in the 70s. Ray Charles, who a bunch of his stuff's actually in the jazz room. Shy Lights, another great Chicago soul vocal group. Chocolate Milk, a nice R&B funk band. George Clinton, of course, who had great solo records in the 80s and some great singles. Bootsy Collins, one of the great bass players of the scene. The Commodores, who of course sang some of the great songs. Confunction, another one of the great funk bands of the 70s and 80s. Crown Heights Affair out of New York, which is kind of a disco-y group. And there's the Miscellaneous C section. And there's some good stuff in these miscellaneous sections too. Taylor Davis is missing there. I forgot to make his sticker. Daz Band's a great 80s band, funk. Some great songs. Oddly enough, the song Daz was by Brick and not by Daz Band. A very common confusion. Delphonics, great Philly soul. The Dells, great soul music. Dramatics is killer. Miscellaneous D's. Earth, Wind and Fire is one of the great funk, R&B, even elements of jazz fusion crossover groups of all time. Fat Larry's Band. Fatback. Fatback's one was great in New York. Disco funk proto groups, that early hip hop pioneers with King Tim the Third. Fatback's really one of the most under radar groups in this whole scene. They deserve a lot more credit. They charted better in Europe and England in the 80s than they did in America, sadly. But there was such a backlash here in America about race and disco and R&B and the sexual intermingling of the groups. Four Tops, one of the great Motown sound groups of all time. Of course, Aretha, who's one of the great architects and the Queen of Soul. Funkadelic, George Clinton's kind of rock funk aspect. Definitely more rocky and guitar-y driven than the Parliament and the G-Funk era stuff. But they happen simultaneously, which is what's weird with Parliament. Miscellaneous E and F. Gap Band out of Oklahoma City, believe it or not. They have 5 or 6 of the great songs of the 80s, early 80s. And there's a real gap in white folks' knowledge of R&B 80, 81, 82, 83. As disco went out of favor, the white community really turned away from black music, and they were very much divided again. And the charts in the late 70s were very much pop, and R&B were very much assimilated because of disco. They were pops on both sides of the charts. Hits on both sides of the charts, I should say. But come early 80s, a lot of the great funk groups made big charting hits that on the R&B charts that the black community and the dance community knew, but white America did not connect with it. And they didn't really again until Prince and Michael come along. Marvin Gaye, of course, is one of the great architects of soul. and his 70s records are seminal and some of the most important records ever made. Al Green, the great gospel funk singer, he's got this gospel funk that's slow but funkin', and you can always kind of shuffle to it. I love Al. Miscellaneous G, Donny Hathaway, one of the great soul singers. Isaac Hayes, a great producer, arranger, songwriter, and a singer and an actor. Isaac Hayes was a very talented guy. Leon Haywood, who Dr. Dre sampled, of course, and Nothing But a G Thing. Willie Hutch, another classic, starts out in Motown. Miscellaneous H. Then it's the Impressions, who have a nice little section here. And the Impressions are, of course, that Chicago sound with Curtis Mayfield. And Jerry Butler was there initially. And the Impressions make a lot of the initial great soul questioning songs of the 60s. Instant Funk's a great funk band. Isley Brothers kind of straddle the funk, R&B, soul line throughout their career and never really sound like anyone else. They all sound like the Isleys, in part because of Ernie Isley's guitar. The Jackson 5, the Jacksons, Michael Jackson, of course, more Motown and huge pop crossover success. Miscellaneous J's, Casey and the Sunshine Band, one of the funnest disco bands, really, if you ask me. Eddie Kendricks, of course, great Temptations singer, had a successful solo career. Kool and the Gang, another great funk. Their early records are kind of instrumental, almost fusion records. But by the 80s, they're making biggest R&B hits out there. Gladys Knight and the Pips. I love Gladys Knight's work with the Pips. It's so beautiful. If I Was Your Woman, one of my favorite songs ever. Miscellaneous K. Lakeside, a great Dayton area group. One of the many Dayton, Ohio bands. LTD with Jeffrey Osborne. Miscellaneous L's. Main Ingredient, a great soul group. Cuba Gooding Jr., dad, was in that group. Tina Marie, another kind of Motown female R&B artist, mass production. Curtis Mayfield's body of work is some of the most important records in the genre. Frankie Beverly and Maze is wonderful. Dance Along. A lot of those songs are great to step to and just kind of dance on that slow, hug your partner close kind of thing. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, where Teddy Pendergrass kind of comes from, as he was a drummer and he ended up going solo. But Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes make some great records. Midnight Star has a couple great 80s records and great hits that were really fun. Miscellaneous M, Miscellaneous N. Ohio Players, I always say, are the greatest R&B group that white folks don't really know nothing about. Most white folks know 3 or 4 Ohio Player songs. They know Fire, they know Love Roller Coaster, but they don't really know the name Ohio Players or what even that is. And they made some great records, from the early Westbound stuff to the Mercury stuff in the mid-70s. Ohio Players should not be ignored. The OJ is more of that Philly soul sound, and they do the R&B soul thing as good as anybody, from Backstabbers all the way through to She Used to Be My Girl. One Way is a great little group from Detroit, if I remember, that has some great little songs that people often forget about. Al Hudson and One Way had some great tracks. Miscellaneous O. And then there's, of course, the Parliament body of work, and Parliament's albums have some of the greatest funk dance songs of all time on them. There's Teddy Pendergrass's solo work, and songs that Close the Door and Turn Off the Lights are love-making staples. Wilson Pickett from Mustang Sally and all those songs he did back in the 60s. Pleasure's a great 80s R&B funk group. Miscellaneous P&Q. Otis Redding, one of the great soul singers of the 60s, who passes way too early. Rufus with Chaka Khan, who makes some great funk records, and she goes on to have a great R&B career of her own. Miscellaneous R. Shalimar, LA Sound. They had that whole Dick Griffey thing going on. Shalimar makes some of the great songs. Make That Move, Night to Remember. Those are some of the funnest early 80s R&B tracks. A lot of them are songs that white folks just don't know. The disco backlash was so strong. Slave's another group that got kind of that same era. Just a Touch of Love and Girls watching the Girls Walking By, Watching You. Those are great songs that white folks don't really remember unless you were part of that dance scene. Sly and the Family Stone's one of the great fusion groups of all time. They bring funk, soul, rock and roll, elements of everything kind of fused together, interracial, intergender. It was a pretty unique phenomenon that Sly Stone was. SOS Band, another one of those 80s groups that was in the early 80s, had some big hits like Take Your Time and Do It Right, And unless you were a dance club scene kid, you don't really remember some of these groups. The Spinners, great Chicago, actually Detroit, I think. R&B soul. Staple Singers, West Coast soul, fantastic. The Stylistics have some of the great R&B soul songs of the early 70s. Sons, a Dayton, Ohio group. The Supremes is, of course, Diana Ross and Motown. Miscellaneous S. And then we have the T-Connection, which everyone knows from the Disco Inferno song. Tavares, another disco R&B kind of fusion group. We have a couple of great songs, including She Used to Be My Girl. Johnny Taylor, but Disco Lady is a great R&B singer. The Temptations, legends. Tower Power, West Coast funk from the Bay Area. Luther Vandross is one of the great R&B singers of all time, who plays with some of the best players, including some jazz musicians. Miscellaneous U. War was one of those great fusion groups as well that fused rock, elements of jazz, elements of soul R&B. Their stuff with Eric Burd's pretty interesting, and their solo career was fantastic. The Whispers are in that kind of cusp of disco into R&B, and the Whispers make 5 or 6 songs that are just outstanding that a lot of people, especially white folks, forget about. Barry White stays relevant because he's always in film soundtracks. You hear a couple of his songs always represented in movies, especially your lovemaking scenes. So Barry White, like Al Green, Marvin Gaye, is kind of one of those names that kind of rings out still. Bill Withers also has some of that same ring out today, with some of his songs staying fairly present in soundtracks, video games. Bobby Womack, one of the great funk soul artists of the 70s. Stevie Wonder's body of work is very important. He's one of the great musicians of all time. You know, he's in that elite category where he's not just a great singer or a player. He's just a unique, special musician of in any genre. Bernard Wright's part of the Jamaica Queens crew, along with Tom Brown and Lenny White. Great musicians that played jazz fusion and backed up a lot of artists. Bernard Wright's 3 solo records are pretty fun. And Zapp and Roger, another Dayton, Ohio group, is just one of the preeminent funk groups of the 80s who had a half dozen tracks that are just floor killers. And if you remember from Dayton, Ohio, Ohio Players were from Dayton, Ohio. Sun was from Dayton, Ohio. Slave was from Dayton, Ohio. Fazio's from Dayton, Ohio. It's a pretty incredible list of groups that Dayton, Ohio, who had a big black industrialist migration of people, but they put out a lot of the great funk bands. It's a bit like the Detroit jazz scene in the late 50s, early 60s. Dayton seems to kind of capture that same thing in the late 60s, early 70s with the R&B. On the bottom down there would be miscellaneous R&B from 80s Janet Jackson and Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston, all the way through to Usher, R. Kelly, and Destiny Child, Britney Spears. Not Britney Spears, sorry. Destiny's Child and Beyonce. But that's the bottom's kind of just a mix of 1987, 89, Belle Biv DeVoe, Boyz II Men, all that New Jack Swing, Teddy Riley stuff. So the bottom's R&B all the way through to 2015s or so. And I didn't really sort that out yet. And it's not really the same as sorting as these groups up top here. So there's 3 shelves of just outstanding funk, soul, R&B. And then if you add in that Prince stuff over here, Minneapolis sound. And then hip-hop, of course, is in a lot of ways an extension of R&B. You know, a lot of the R&B that we had in the late 70s fuses into the hip-hop sound of the 80s and 90s. New Jack Swing, of course, was one of the big melting pots there. And it all stems from the blues and all stems from jazz. This music's all linked together. So that's my R&B section, and that's part 1 of this video. So anyway, that's my R&B shelf, and one of the things you kind of notice watching what I just did is I'll often say this group had a couple of great songs. And I think that's one of the differences between jazz and R&B and hip-hop. Jazz makes great records that are great from front to back and a great listen all the way through. And in R&B, soul, funk, and especially in hip-hop, great records from front to back are rare. Just rare. For every Marvin Gaye What's Going On, or Stevie Wonder Talking Book, or Sly Stone's Stand, there's thousands of R&B records that have a great single or maybe 2 singles on A and B side. And then the rest of the album's kind of filler. Sometimes it's cover songs. Sometimes they'll be covering a rock song or a country. It's weird how few of these bands make great albums. Earth, Wind & Fire you can listen to all the way through. Those guys can play their asses off. Ohio Players make great records all the way through. But a lot of the records, it's hard to stay fresh. I think funk's probably something that transcends live and kicks an audience into gear, but in the studio can sound kind of canned, sparse. Even the great James Brown, you need volume to fill in those spaces. When you have that limited, sparse, repetitious, funky groove at a low volume, it seems very minimal and wanting more. But when you turn that up on the dance floor, the bass will resonate and fill some of that space. The crack of the snare will layer over some more of that space. The vocal will now fill in those gaps even better. The rhythm guitars in there coloring. And of course the bass is almost always setting the melodic structure that you're going to hum along to. But it just doesn't seem to lend itself to making great records. Otis Redding made great records. Al Green's records are pretty solid, but even those have songs that are lesser than. It's definitely a single-driven, party-driven, charts-driven, radio hit-driven industry that is, to me, the most different thing from jazz. And of course, along with that era of funk and R&B, there's the actual jazz R&B stuff of guys like George Duke and George Benson and Roy Ayers and Grover Washington and Donald Byrd and the Blackbirds and Weather Report, that are kind of straddling the line between rhythm and blues, fusion jazz, the blues. Some of it just gets straight up pop. Guys like Stanley Clarke, just incredible players. There's a real searching for identity, I feel like, in R&B at this time. And Quincy Jones is, of course, the backbone of a lot of this stuff, making George Benson a big hit, big star, along with guys like Rufus and Michael Jackson, the Brothers Johnson. Quincy Jones' reach from jazz into film and R&B and pop, he's a pretty impressive figure that even in the 50s he was making big waves in jazz. Guys like Sonny Stitt, who've been around for a while, were doing Quincy Jones arrangements. Quincy comes in with quite a bang, and his career is fairly impressive. Well, extremely impressive, really. But there's definitely so many links between jazz and R&B. You can't really extricate the two from each other. From the early strains of Count Basie, swing, and the danceability, and then Louis Jordan distilling it kind of down, and then guys like James Brown coming along and saying, let's simplify that even a little bit more, make the beat even a little bit straighter. And the lineage is all very interconnected. And that's true for all black music. All black music from the last 100 years, you can connect it from one decade to the next. And as a guy who's DJed for a long time, black kids know old black music, and old black people know young kids' black music. It's very much, we are happy to hear our music anywhere we go, and we will kind of appreciate any genre of it, especially if you can kind of mix it all together for us. You can play I Feel Good, I knew that at a wedding, and there's 6-year-old kids dancing their asses off. You know, it's just, there's something about black music that they represent it as a people. Like, it represents us. It's not just limited to this subgenre or this decade or my childhood. Black music is black music, and I think they're actually getting away from that now. Guys like Kanye West haven't helped. But with white people, there's no way you can just say, I'm going to play some white people music, and they're all going to respond to it and appreciate it. Because white people are very fractured in what they love, what they find interesting. They by no means feel defensive or protective of all white culture or white music. And so there's no identification with white listeners as, oh, I need to like this, it's by a white artist, I need to support my white artists. So identifying what a white crowd of people wants to hear is tougher than a room of black people. You know, with the real black people, I can find their G-spot pretty quick. And really comes down to their age more than anything else as to what's their wheelhouse and then what other stuff they're going to tolerate, what other stuff they're going to enjoy, what's going to be nostalgic for them, what's going to be kind of new and fresh. And I try not to do a whole lot of educating when I'm rocking a party. It's not my job to play some obscure thing that you've never heard before, but trust me, you're going to like it. People want to dance to what they know. People want to have fun with songs that they are familiar with. And for me, I could always show them 100 songs they don't know, but it seems self-indulgent. It seems just obtuse and irreverent. You know, if they're dancing to Marvin Gaye, well, who am I to force some new neo-soul on them that they've never heard of? You know, even the Sharon Jones, the Dap Tones, a lot of that stuff, I find it hard to mix that stuff in a real R&B set. And the guy that recognizes it is some white dude with a beard with big earplugs, you know, drinking some barley wine going, oh, I love their records. It doesn't connect for some reason. But R&B is very linked to jazz. And jazz doesn't really die. And I've said this before. It just kind of morphs itself into rhythm and blues and even early rock and roll, which was really just rhythm and blues as well. You know, that distinction's very fuzzy. And from Howlin' Wolf to Chuck Berry to Little Richard to Louis Jordan to James Brown, the lines are very blurred. You know, Booker T and the MGs, it's blurry. It's blurry out there. You can't see through that, even with a monocle. You know, and so I think people who don't want to recognize the connection between great rhythm and blues and jazz are kind of missing the point. Because they're thinking that jazz is only that kind of abstract, obscure, cerebral, non-sexual, non-pulsing, non-party, not fun. Jazz has to be very intellectual, and it has to be... And I think that's why jazz fans are so doing jazz a disservice. Because jazz was the R&B of its day. For 3-4 decades, jazz was... If you rented a band, there was no DJs to hire. You rented a swing band. If you were white, you got one of the local white bands. If you were black, you got one of the local black swing groups. And they would do a range of things from swing standards to the blues to stripped down 5-piece ensembles doing kind of modern rhythm and blues, rock and roll. And it was all people had fun. So these bands, both black and white, had to have chops, had to have a large repertoire, and that was just the music of the nation, from the Waltons through MASH. We danced to jazz music. You know, we danced to that early swing rhythm and blues sound. And rhythm and blues definitely codifies it and restricts it down to a more of a finite, limited, let's have some instrumentation and some soloing, but it's not going to be purely about that. You know, and the lyrics are usually throwaway in dance music. That's something people have to recognize. Even in modern Nicki Minaj and who's the other chick that's her challenger to the throne right now? All that modern dance music, and this includes the white stuff as well. It's meant to be about a pulsing groove that you can dance to in the club. And you just throw the words on, and you try to throw something on there that's sexually clever. But innuendo is kind of a lost art. We've lost the subtlety, and the clever things we used to say ain't so clever anymore. It's just kind of almost offensive. Not even almost. It's offensive to a lot of people. But sex and music was always meant to be charged and offensive, and dance music was always meant to be on the cusp of what's acceptable. That's never changed. And part of why the white American Protestant middle America had such a problem with jazz is it was such a sexual music. It was very sexually charged. And that interracial mingling with a sexually charged music and alcohol, it just threatened the institutions that so much of these mental foundations in America are built on. You know, race and separation and divide and the control of the poor. It's all built on one of those bricks called racism. It's a big part of how they maintain the divide in this country and keep us from having unity. And like I said, nothing scares the powerful more than a united majority. if 90% of us didn't see race, religion, economics, and said, you know, we all want health care, clean water, and good schools, regardless of abortion. We'll talk about that some other day. In fact, let a woman, her family, and their doctor talk about that. That's a simple solution to that. Leave it for a doctor, her family, and it doesn't need to be this federal mandate. It's being used completely to manipulate voters into voting one way regardless of all other issues. We're going to polarize you and make you feel outraged on this one thing. And it's true on both sides. And it shouldn't be in part of the most powerful nation in the world's federal elections like it is, and it has been for 5 decades. It's race, the way it ramps up between every election cycle towards the next election. Guarantee again, come next election, there's going to be some city on fire. It's all so cleverly done and designed. But it's all telling the story of the black man in America and his struggle to integrate, to belong. And we so often forget that the original American, aside from the native people, there was periods in the 1700s where the population of blacks was greater than the whites by a large margin. The immigration hadn't really started to come over yet, but the black slaves sure had. So in many ways, they're more entitled to this land than we are. But it's not about talking politics or even economics. I've gotten so disenfranchised with political debate. It's lunacy. It's meant to just keep two camps as far apart as possible, and the polarity and the division, it's disgusting, and I'm not going to help enable it. I'm not going to be part of that. I believe what I believe. And I don't really adhere to nation policy to begin with. As a Canadian who's lived in America for 30-some years, I'm a human being. To live on Earth, that's my citizenship. You know, and I've often said the opposite of the society you're born into is the reality of all things. And if you don't like the society you're a part of, recognize that it doesn't define you. You're not an American, you're not Jamaican, you're not Angolan. Those parameters and lines are very temporal creations and have no definition on your birth bearing. Human earthling, that's what defines me. And that collection of societies over thousands of years, all that together encompasses reality. My society is but a slice of reality, and to allow that society to dictate my reality is very narrow. But society would have you think, oh, this is the only way it can be done. We're the pinnacle of evolution. Nothing's ever been greater than us. And it's never stronger than when you live in an empire. And the truth of it is, we're not these nations. We're not these races. We're just human earthlings. Brothers and sisters commingling, marching around the planet, looking for a good meal, a fire, a couple drinks, and a place to have some breeding done. And if I'm lucky, I'm going to look up at the stars and question my place in this cosmos. But I'm certainly not going to have somebody else tell me my place in this cosmos. And I'm certainly not going to turn the television on and let it define my reality, and let it define the parameters of my scope of my life's potential. Whatever an Aborigine did 40,000 years ago in the outback, whatever that Siberian who crossed that land bridge did 10, 15, 30,000 years ago, whatever the ancient Chinese did, whatever the future does, that's all my potential reality. I can be all of that. So it's just a crazy introspective thing, jazz and music. It really helps me delve deep into our history and the fabric of our existence, and recognizing that, boy, when we latch onto the bigger human spirituality that unifies us all, that empowerment, that recognition of we share a common interest. And that's the crazy thing, is that people on the left and right both want better schools and healthcare. People on the left and right both want clean water, better environments. You know, there's not this great divide ideologically between us. But they find the little things that do polarize us, and that's all they talk about. That's all they sensationalize. That's all they put in the news. Guns, abortion, race, crime, drugs, keeping us so on edge that we can't think cleanly, we can't think clearly. I can't work with my neighbor because he might have a sign in his yard that says Blue Lives Matter, And I think Black Lives Matter, when in reality both lives matter. And no one should ever have to make you choose between one or the other. That's propaganda. No one who started out by saying Black Lives Matter was saying Blue Lives don't matter. But BLM has turned into more than it was. It's become this incredible, another source of divide. And they will find everything that we give them opportunity to use, and they will use it against us. So anyway, that's for R&B records. It's a nice little collection of soul, funk, hip-hop, reggae, and then you put that with all the jazz records. It's a fairly great documentation of the black experience in America the last 100 years. And then around the bottom of this room is my rock and roll. From 600, 800 classic rock records, a bunch of 80s alternative goth industrial records, a bunch of 80s metal, 70s metal, from Aerosmith, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, all those great groups, Metallica, some country, some 50s rock, surfbilly, all that stuff. I have all that stuff around the bottom of this room, and I'll probably show you that stuff at some point because it's part of the history, and almost all that music borrows from this black music. You know, it's crazy how much, when you get all this stuff compiled and you realize that, man, listening to some of these early rock and roll, R&B, late jazz, it all sounds the same. It just kind of changes its name, and each generation wants to put its own little label on it. But the fact of the matter is, dance music's dance music, and it doesn't really change. Even disco didn't really die. House music in Detroit and Chicago and in Europe kept that whole sound going. House and disco are pretty much interchangeable. So R&B is a very important aspect of black music. It's a very important aspect of jazz, and jazz and R&B share the same tree trunk. And when the avant-garde splits off and goes this way and free jazz goes this way, it's but a small branch on a much larger tree trunk that has the entire chronology of black music and the history that goes with it. And so for jazz fans to limit their scope to saying, I only like what's on the end of that branch, it's doing the history a disservice, because it's not just that intellectual, cerebral music that was meant to connect with a small audience. And if it connects with you, that's great. It does with me at times. But jazz is a much bigger, broader thing. And in some ways, when you make it a broader definition, it also kind of trims off some of those branches of saying, that's a sapling that's on its own little roots. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. Label it what you want, but it's still very much all in an interwoven fabric. So jazz, R&B, hip-hop, even reggae, it all has such a lineage that's very woven, and most of it starts with the blues. You know, guys like Willie Dixon. These guys were such architects of that soulful sound, bringing the pain of their life. Bo Diddley's as much early rock and roll as he is rhythm and blues. You know, and some of these guys, Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley, are tough to categorize. Where are you going to put him? Little Richard's tough to categorize. Where are you going to put him? Is he rhythm and blues? Not really. Is he rock and roll? It's melded. It's all been melded into one thing. And the branches shoot off of it. Led Zeppelin shoots out of that tree. You know, they do. Even a lot of the art rock, prog rock, a lot of that shoots off from the jazz avant-garde and jazz progressiveness. Yes, and Queen and Pink Floyd, they're borrowing from that jazz ideology. Black music in this world has become a very important source of creativity, pulse, energy, and emotive constructs. It really reveals the human condition that creates it. And a lot of this music is so open to the interpretation of how I feel now, unlike the European traditional classical tradition where you're kind of redoing the piece as it was initially intended to be, always. With a lot of this music, it's about what's the groove and the feel now. And a funk band doesn't mind slowing its song down by a third if it's feeling it's in that slower pocket tonight. But if they have to play it fast, they can do that too. In jazz, it was always inventive and creative and open to restructuring. Part of the basic simplicity of the way these pieces fit in rhythm and blues allows that reconstruct to happen, and you can double up certain things and reduce certain things. It's very easy to construct and deconstruct rhythm and blues and jazz of that nature. We're not talking Ornette Coleman here. We're talking simple, basic, move your feet kind of music. So anyway, it's a simple little episode on my the continuation of jazz and rhythm and blues, and it was rhythm and blues that really brought me back to jazz in as deep a sense as it did. The Beatles were really the first impetus to go back to the early things, but they get me into all the early Little Richards and Ray Charles and Duke Ellingtons and Louis Armstrongs, and then you just start feeling all that, and you realize just how interwoven this entire fabric, this quilt of music is. Y'all be safe. I'll talk to y'all soon. Appreciate y'all. Take care.